Supply chain management continues to be a hot topic in countless organizations in light of ongoing geopolitical challenges, evolving impacts of climate change, new tariffs, changing labor markets, and much more. How can supply chain and procurement leaders attack these and other challenges? It starts with building and implementing a strategic sourcing strategy. This is Kevin Donahue, Senior Director with Protiviti, welcoming you to a new edition of Powerful Insights. Protiviti recently published a white paper, Strategic Sourcing, Gaining Advantage, Mitigating Risk, which dives into this topic and provides practical guidance on anticipating and mitigating supply chain risk while improving resilience and responsiveness. I recently had the pleasure of interviewing Lucas Manganaro, one of the authors of this paper. Lucas is a managing director with Protiviti and leads the supply chain innovation practice. Throughout his 20-plus year career, Lucas has held multiple supply chain and procurement leadership roles focused on transforming business processes and leveraging technology to improve top and bottom line results. Lucas, thanks for joining me. Great to speak with you today.
Yeah, great to be with you, Kevin.
So supply chains today, whether they're regional or global, they seem to be as fragile as ever. Why is this the case? Is it a matter of better data, analytics, and reporting are revealing problem areas to these organizations with greater precision and frequency? Or are there other factors at play?
That's a good question. I think it's a couple things that are working against supply chains. The speed with which things change on the global stage, I think, has increased really substantially. So if you think about supply chains being as resilient and as flexible as they've ever been, the world has gotten more volatile around them. And so that makes them appear more fragile by comparison to history. And then in addition to that, I think there have been decades of investments made in leaning out supply chains, right? And really trying to cost optimize. But those cost optimizations in many cases have, they result in trade-offs, right? And some of those trade-offs mean that it's very expensive and it's very challenging to make large-scale changes to those very lean and very efficient supply chains. For instance, if a lot of the dependency upstream in the supply chain has been concentrated in a particular country, and then we have, an exogenous event that disrupts everything coming out of that country or adds cost to everything coming out of that country, the ability to pivot can be limited. It can take a while to do that, and it can be quite costly. So in a world where volatility has increased and the speed of that volatility has increased substantially, and supply chains have made themselves quite lean and quite efficient over many decades, pivoting is not as simple as we all wish it was.
And Lucas, with regard to this volatility, are you referring, say, to geopolitical volatility, regulatory volatility, cyber attack and ransomware type volatility, or all of the above?
Unfortunately, it's a little bit of all of the above, and sort of when you think of it that way, it starts to sound like sort of a scary world, and it gets pretty easy to get a little bit pessimistic. But I think it's really a matter of all of those things changing in small ways, but on top of each other, and then you get sort of compounded risks. So the volatility geopolitically certainly is an issue today, but that manifests itself in the form of volatility and tariffs, in the form of currency concerns, taxation concerns, country by country. And so all of these things, each taken in isolation, probably wouldn't be enough to make your average company contemplate a physical change to their supply chain. But when you start compounding them, it can get really costly really quick. And moreover, it can create shortage challenges, right? And that's, I think, the thing that many supply chains had the luxury over years and years of sort of stable geopolitical environments, stable currency environments. we all kind of had the luxury of taking a little bit of a wait and see approach when things popped up that represented risk. We don't really have that luxury as much today because while we maybe can absorb a certain degree of temporary cost, it's very difficult to absorb absence of inventory because that becomes a revenue hindrance, right? You lose the inventory that's available to promise. You lose the ability to fulfill customer orders, and customers, unfortunately or fortunately, have a very strong memory when things don't go right. So I think in this kind of world that we're living in, and I don't think it's going to slow down, the pace of change, the amount of volatility, it's not going to slow down. I think we have to adapt to it, and we have to be ready to contemplate revenue side impacts and cost side impacts at the same time. And that means we need a whole lot more data that's a whole lot more easily accessible.
And I left out climate volatility, whether from drought, and I know everything that's happened with the Panama Canal, as well as hurricane, typhoon, cyclone impacts around the world and what those things do.
Yeah, and even as simple as just good old fashioned shipping disruption domestically, right? Over the road trucking is still a big part of most domestic retail and consumer supply chains, as well as the over the ocean and the steamship lanes and the rail lanes. All of these things are susceptible to weather changes, and the challenge again is when the expectations, particularly of consumers, are increasingly for immediate satisfaction of an order. The timelines that you have to work with when you have a disruption, whether it's caused by weather or caused by something else, everything happens very quickly, right? In a world where you can hop on a very well-known retail website and purchase most things that you would want and have them at your door the same day or the next day, that leaves very little margin for error.
And Lucas, the challenges you've been describing, would you say they are industry agnostic, or are there specific industry segments such as consumer products, retail, that are particularly vulnerable?
It's a great question. So I think the large buckets of issues, so the risks around geopolitics, taxation, currency, weather, shortages of raw material, these things impact most industries, but they impact them differently, right? So I would say that if you go up to the big picture, it's relatively industry agnostic, but which things cause the worst impacts gets very industry specific very quickly. As you can see with issues like labor, as a for instance, in certain industries where we have a high dependence on domestic labor, whether it be parcel shipping or even assembly of automobiles, retail, frontline retail staff. These things, you need a domestic workforce. That domestic workforce is in shortage right now and quite costly. So it's hard to avoid those impacts when they're local and they're specific to your business model, if that makes sense. So I think that, which impact is going to be the worst and which one is going to be the most difficult to mitigate is a very industry specific set of questions. But the broad buckets of risk, whether it's cyber, weather, et cetera, they're affecting everybody.
Great. You've done a super job of kind of defining the landscape, if you will. We recently published a paper, and I know you authored this, or one of the authors, Strategic Sourcing, Gaining Advantage, Mitigating Risk. And we will include a link to that paper in our show notes. So in the paper, you address the importance of shifting the organizational mindset to a strategic sourcing strategy. What is this exactly, and how does this approach differ from what many organizations are doing right now in regard to their supply chain management?
So I think that so I've been doing strategic sourcing work for clients for a very long time. And over that time, The definitions have shifted, I think, a little bit for convenience. The definitions of words, right? And a lot of organizations refer to strategic sourcing. Let's separate maybe the direct side from the indirect side. On the direct side, your sourcing is very much strategic always. You're dependent on your suppliers, perhaps as raw materials for your product or as suppliers of finished goods if you're a retailer. And so it is, those relationships are strategic in the sense that they're absolutely core to the revenue model of the business, and those partners are essential. On the indirect side, you oftentimes have a little bit more flexibility, but the language that is used over the last, let's say, 10 years, oftentimes strategic sourcing meant really RFP, RFI, RFQ, RFP type activities where you're bidding a specific scope of work to a limited set of suppliers in order to, hopefully increase service levels, reduce pricing, et cetera. And that often gets referred to as strategic sourcing. But I think it falls a little bit short, particularly in an environment like we have now, where we need to get a lot more strategic about our sources of supply, not just the simple requirements of the items or services that we're purchasing, the piece price and so forth. But we really need to start thinking about what is the purpose behind what we're purchasing. What are we trying to accomplish? Does it need to be accomplished with a like-for-like purchase? Are there alternative ways to accomplish the same end, or alternative locations to go to, right? Is sourcing from different countries than we have sourced from in the past? How do we identify quality supply bases or nurture quality supply bases in countries in which we haven't been doing business for a while? Where can we replace products with services? Where can we replace services with technologies? These are the things that I think sourcing organizations increasingly need to be considering as they build strategies going forward. It's simply not going to be adequate from a risk mitigation standpoint to identify a series of 4 or 5 or 6 suppliers and go to them on a repeat basis, trying to bid down pennies of cost on a unit. That just won't work.
Great. And I believe then in the paper you address some approaches to accomplish those objectives. This approach encompasses a number of key principles, practices, and systems. Again, you walk through these in the paper, but can you walk me through those briefly here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and some of these are going to sound really quite traditional, at least to the procurement folks that may be listening in, right? Conducting robust spend analysis, doing supplier vetting, identification, vetting, onboarding, discovering new sources of supply, nurturing new sources of supply where they are not at scale or don't exist in the form that you need them in. These are all things that, by and large, I think the average chief procurement officer and their organization would say they're doing today. I think they take on a little bit new meaning in the environment that we're facing now. So let's just kind of take them one at a time. If we talk about doing basic data cleansing and spend analysis, what do we really mean? Well, we can't stop at transactional analysis. We need to start looking at other sources of data to better understand, again, what is the nature of that spend and the relationship with the supplier? What are they delivering to us that add value to our organization and our core mission? And in some cases, when we identify that value, we're going to find alternative approaches to producing that value versus what we have traditionally been buying. Supplier identification, many years ago, there were large paper books, printed books of suppliers, and your average procurement agent your category manager had one of those books on their desk, and they went through and identified suppliers in that way. That's not working anymore. That's not reasonable anymore. So thinking about how to discover suppliers in a global environment where you may be switching between countries of supply, it's a different activity that requires a different set of tools, because getting it wrong has never been more costly than it is now. And then, as I said, the processes of onboarding suppliers, contracting, bidding, all of these things are increasingly important to get right, because we're going to be doing it a lot more often than we have in the past. Because things may disrupt our relationships with our existing suppliers that are outside of the control of both parties.
Lucas, a quick follow-up to that. Just wondering to what extent the average procurement function is technology enabled to support some of these areas like supplier onboarding, management, obviously data, and if what I guess the criticality or level of criticality is around having the right technology to help with this, given the changing landscape you've been discussing.
Yeah, so I guess where procurement organizations have been quite fortunate is that there's a large list of really innovative technology companies, software companies out there. That space has had no shortage of new entrants over the last 2 decades, whether it's procure-to-pay systems, it's e-sourcing or spend analytics solutions, contract lifecycle management solutions. There is a lot of technology that's available, and that technology landscape has a lot of participants that are pushing each other. So that's good from an innovation standpoint. On the flip side of that, and I think you can get a little bit of an indication from the process mining industry, procurement is one of the best early use cases for process mining, because a lot of what procurement does is transactional. It has timestamps, and there's a lot of back and forth with suppliers. So it's relatively easy to map, and therefore it's relatively easy to mine. What's interesting, though, is where those technologies struggled in the early days is they found that so much of what your average category manager, your average procurement analyst or tactical buyer was doing was outside of those systems. So here we have all this horsepower with these great packages that are available in the market, and yet our people are spending a large part of their effort outside of those systems. And so that points to 2 different things. One, there are gaps. The systems are designed to be profitable, and therefore they're designed to solve the big problems, which leaves space in between those problems, small problems that aren't necessarily profitable to solve as a software company. Those are left to the clients to solve. So that's a challenge. Also, if you have a series of those applications sort of throughout your tech stack, even just your procurement and finance tech stack, they're not necessarily designed to work with and talk to each other. So you have translation issues, integration issues, the work between the work, right? And so that's where I think there's an opportunity for a lot of increased focus on technology investment, not in the large packages, which many mature organizations already have and have spent quite a lot of effort on, but focusing in the in-between spaces. How do I make it easier for my folks to use these big tools and not be working 50% in an Excel spreadsheet and then plugging that into a multi-million-dollar piece of software that I've purchased, right? And we can do that in a lot of cases nowadays by upskilling our folks and using the tools that are available. Most large organizations have a hyperscaler, whether it's Google Cloud or Azure or it's Amazon Web Services. These are creating in ecosystems of kind of Lego bricks, right? Where a person who is technical, but not super technical, can go and assemble a product, if you will, from all of these services that accomplishes one of those in-between tasks without making a multi-million-dollar software investment. And I think that is really the future that we all need to be focused on, is the work in between the work. How do I build tools that don't require massive support, that are based on crowdsourced capabilities, that an average business user can leverage.
Great. Let's pivot and talk a little bit about customers, specifically meeting customer expectations and the customer experience. Two very important enterprise priorities for most organizations today, arguably all organizations today. How does better supply chain planning and inventory management support these critical objectives? I guess particularly when thinking about organizations like in consumer products and retail, where product availability is so important.
Yeah, great. It's a good question. So I think you said the most important part there right at the end of the question. Product availability is so important, and we live in a world where consumer expectations are growing every day. Whether it's for the proliferation of options of things that are available to them, or it is the expectation that they can have them when they want, where they want, how they want. Those expectations aren't going to go backwards, and so the ability to meet those expectations requires a much closer understanding of what demand is likely to be. It requires a much greater understanding of what your supply constraints are to meet that demand. And again, in a world of increased competition, cost is still a challenge. So we can't simply turn our back on decades of cost management and cost efficiency and say, well, we'll just overbuy everything, right? There isn't margin available in a competitive world to support all that inventory. So we have to stay lean, but we have to stay very, very close to the demand signals that are out there. And oh, by the way, those demand signals now come from a much wider array of sources. So we're talking, not about just channel partners who have sort of a structured approach to ordering from you and sort of a predictable way of buying. We're talking about social media. We're talking about very unstructured sources of data that can give us indications of what demand is likely to be for a particular product or set of products. And if we don't pay attention to those things, or don't pay enough attention to them or interpret them incorrectly, it's very, very easy to do everything right from an execution standpoint, but execute the wrong plan because you misunderstood the signal. And so the importance of planning has never been greater, but also the ability to pivot on the execution side to meet that plan has never been more important. The pressure on downstream supply chains in a world where planning is very adaptive, the pressure on the supply chain execution side is much, much greater than it's ever been.
Well, Lucas, this has been a fantastic conversation. And I know we could go much more into that topic around meeting customer expectations and the data involved alone. But if I'm a supply chain or procurement leader in my organization, what are the roadblocks I can expect to encounter as I build and implement my strategic sourcing strategy? And perhaps more importantly, what are the best approaches to address these roadblocks?
Yeah, so I think the roadblocks that I guess I see impacting clients most frequently, if I kind of couch it that way, talent has to be at or near the top of the list, and it's not just the availability of talent, but it's the motivation. You have to give the workforce that we need and the skills that we need in that workforce. We have to have an engaged workforce, not just available, but engaged. We need them to be innovative. We need them to push boundaries. And frankly, we're relying on quite a high degree of optimism as we ask people to solve problems that don't have a standard solution. And so that means there's a lot of competition for the very best talent, but also we need to be cultivating talent. So some of the things that historically you could solve very short term, I'll just go buy talent. That's not so easy anymore. If you're not providing a good environment and a good career path and to nurture that talent, it'll leave as fast as it came. So that I think is a big challenge: getting the right talent and then creating an environment that encourages and cultivates that talent is super important. And the other thing I would say is a lot of the ways in which we have scorecarded and measured ourselves historically very much narrowed the focus of the day-to-day work. And that leaves us sort of blind to the big movements, or creates the potential to leave us sort of blind to the big movements. And, as I kind of stressed a little bit earlier, I think we're in a world where in a lot of cases, products are going to be replaced with services. Services are going to be replaced with technology, or at least augmented. We need to be thinking about alternative methods of achieving an outcome, not just think of ourselves as people who buy things on behalf of the organization. So we have to cultivate an environment of innovation. And that innovation has to be in lockstep with the core mission of the enterprise that we're supporting.
What a great conversation. I want to thank Lucas for joining me today to discuss these issues that are certainly impacting organizations around the world. Two things really stood out to me. One, organizations need the right data to attack this issue. And two, they need the right people to attack this issue. For more information, I encourage you to read our white paper, Strategic Sourcing, Gaining Advantage, Mitigating Risk. You can find that on our Protiviti website, or I'll put the link in our show notes. And as always, I remind you to please subscribe to our Powerful Insights podcast series and to review us wherever you get your podcast content.